Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar today, Navigating DEI in ADR Practice. Today, we're going to focus on a recent research study that was exploring the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, and ADR, alternative dispute resolution, from the perspective of practitioners themselves. My name is Rick Buccheri, and I'll be the moderator of today's conversation. I'm also the Director of Programs at ADR Vantage, which is the host of today's session. ADR Vantage is a leading consulting firm working at the intersection of three fields of practice that most influence employees and their environments: conflict management, which includes the spectrum of services that is characterized as alternative dispute resolution; organization effectiveness; and diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility services. ADR Vantage also sponsored the research that we're going to be focused on today in partnership with the University of Baltimore. And to share some of the background about that research and to give context for today's conversation, I'm joined by the lead researcher herself, Dr. Yunzi Ray Tan. Dr. Tan is an associate professor and the director of the Master of Science program in Negotiation and Conflict Management at the University of Baltimore. She's a social and organizational psychologist by training, and her research teaching interests include diversity, equity, inclusion, and conflict management in group and organizational contexts. Ray, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Rick, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here.
I'm also joined today by Cheryl Jamison. Cheryl is an experienced mediator and facilitator. Currently, she spends a great deal of her time as a belonging and connectedness advocate, assisting organizations to create truly welcoming environments. She is also the former executive director of the Association for Conflict Resolution. Cheryl, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Rick, for having me and for doing this, this webinar. Thanks.
And thank you all for joining. I want to lay out a little bit of our format today to give folks an idea of where we're headed. So the bulk of this session will be a conversation between myself, Ray, and Cheryl. If time permits, later on, we will open breakout rooms, give you an opportunity to engage with and learn from each other. We're going to end the session with a formal Q&A where we'll invite you to come on camera, come on microphone, and ask your questions of us directly. For now, if you do have questions as the conversation unfolds, we encourage you to put those into the chat. We'll try to pause the conversation at certain times and see what kind of questions we're getting and address those as best as we can. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm joined by a team of folks from ADR Vantage. You may see us with the ADR Vantage background. With us today, we have co-founder and president Diane Lipsey, managing director Tara Taylor, director of operations Shane Julius, and senior operations and project specialist Haywood Elias. The four of them will join our conversation at various points. They may raise questions from the audience. They're also supporting us with some logistical help. So I just want to acknowledge that they're all here. We're also going to launch a poll we'll check back on the results, but we just want to get a sense of who's with us today. Are you an ADR practitioner, a program manager, a DEI practitioner, or something else altogether? So feel free to take that. And Ray, I'd like to start the conversation with you. So you're the lead researcher, and it's your findings that we're going to discuss today. So I'd love for you maybe to give some background about this research, set some context, and how this all started.
Sure. So last summer, I came across a call for papers announcement that was put out by the Negotiation and Conflict Management Research Journal, which is an academic journal that publishes research on negotiation and conflict management at different levels and in a variety of different domains. The call for papers was for a special issue, which focuses on contributions that will help scholars learn from practitioners in the field to hopefully guide and inform future research and theory. So with this call for papers in mind, I reached out to Tara and team at ADR Vantage to see if they will be interested to collaborate with me and to develop a study that we could contribute to this special issue. From there, we had a number of conversations and eventually decided to create a survey study that would allow us to explore the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ADR from the ADR practitioners' perspectives and experiences. I would also mention that, coming out of our conversations and in designing the study, we were the focus of the study was also in part motivated by, the social tensions and the racial disparities that had, really come to the fore across the country last year. And we felt it was timely and important to, really take a closer look at how issues and conflicts around DEI might show up in ADR practice and vice versa. So here we are.
Great. And just thanks for that. And to set some additional context, is there anything about the structure of the survey or, kind of number of participants or things like that that are worth mentioning?
Sure. I think we designed a survey study, and it was a open-ended survey questionnaire with a list of 10 questions that will really get at, they were designed to get at, really drawing from practitioners, in the ADR field, broadly defined, to share the experiences and perspectives as it relates to, the linkages between DEI and ADR, in their practice experiences and such. So we sent out the survey, I believe, last December of 2020, and it was about almost 160 ADR practitioners from the ADR Vantage roster was invited to participate in this survey. And then eventually the final sample size was 43. So that's a little under, 30%. And in terms of the, the demographic breakdown, if you will. So in terms of race and ethnicity, about 72% of the respondents self-identified as white or Caucasian. And then we have about 20% self-identified as Black or African-American. And then a few other, racial ethnic categories in the remaining percentages. In terms of gender distribution, it was pretty much evenly split, about 49 female respondents and about 50% self-identified as male respondents. And then in terms of the areas of practice, it was really hard to tease out. I think, what we saw from the survey findings was that, most of the practitioners that participate in the survey, had a combination of, experience in mediation, arbitration, dispute system design, and so forth and so on. And then I guess two other quick points in terms of the statistics. The median age for the respondents who participated in the survey was about 60 years old. And then the median years of experience was about 24 years of overall ADR related experience, I should say.
Yeah, thanks for giving some of that background. And, it might seem on the surface like, oh, wow, this is a really small sample size to dig into a theme, that's kind of so broad as this. But we're going to get deeper into the findings and talk and even read and hear some of the actual responses of, folks who took this survey, because there's such rich information contained in those survey responses that I think this conversation could extend, almost indefinitely. Like there's just so many different ways to unpack this. So maybe we can get a little bit into it here. I'd like to read, if I could, a couple of the responses from the survey. So one of the questions on the survey, one of these open-ended questions asked, in what ways, if any, have you, what ways, if any, have your own and or your participants' demographic and socio-cultural identities influenced the ADR process or outcomes? So I'm going to read two responses here. As an older white male, I assume that my age, gender, and race may unconsciously affect my perception and therefore my actions. The second quote here, As a white practitioner, I often wonder how my privilege might be influencing the way I facilitate an ADR process. Where are my biases? What assumptions am I making about balance, self-determination, and fairness? How do the parties view me, and how does that impact how readily they share their personal stories, perspectives, and real views? So it sounds like, there's practitioners that might be generally aware that they could and likely do have biases, but don't have that specific, nuanced understanding of what those biases are and how they're showing up. So maybe this is too broad of a question to start, but for both of you, what are some ways in which our biases show up in our ADR practice?
Okay, so first of all, before I get started, I just want to thank those 43 people who responded to the survey. I wish there was a way that we could get other people, including myself, to, when those come in your inbox, to actually respond. We don't have a lot of research on this topic with regard to ADR practitioners. So yeah, I wish we had more people responding, but thanks, Rick, for doing the survey. So in answer to your question, Rick, so obviously I have a kind of different perspective of the average person who completed the survey, being a Black female. Having worked with practitioners, I think one of the ways that it shows up is the sense that when I walk into the room as a mediator, that my race, ethnicity does not matter. That, I've talked to practitioners who believe that they can mediate any issue, any person. And that's not true. It does have an impact when you sit as a party and there's nobody around the table who shares any visible dimension of diversity. And so I think that's one way that it shows up, is in our feeling that, no, it doesn't matter to the outcome of the process, doesn't matter in terms of the parties and how they look, how they respond. I think, although again, we don't have a lot of research for this, but anecdotally, I think we can determine that responses are somewhat different. I've certainly seen it in mediations that I've had, where people of color or just females will turn their bodies towards me to talk to me because I'm the only one that shares any dimension of diversity with them. So it does matter. I think that's one way that it does.
Yeah, so build on Cheryl's comments. I was just going to, concur one of the earlier things I think, Cheryl, you mentioned, which is the idea that there really is a deficit of research, and specifically empirical research, on the role, the influence of bias or perception distortions, within the ADR context. And I was going to mention a little bit in response to this question, Rick, in terms of what we know about how bias show up, how bias affect and influence the ADR process and, eventual outcomes. One of the things that, I did following I guess as part of the analysis of the survey findings, was to go back to the literature, go back to the scholarship and the research, particularly in the ADR and dispute conflict resolution realm, to look at, what evidence do we actually have, or, what conclusions or findings do we, or whether the findings or conclusions currently exist to help us better make sense of the relationship between two. And unfortunately, there really isn't much in that front. But the good news is that this interest or this attention on the issue of bias and how bias might potentially show up and play out in the ADR process has been looked at, and there have been some, scholars and researchers in the area, in the field, in the ADR domain, that have drawn from the very rich body of cognitive social psychology where there is a wealth of research and empirical evidence to show the impact of bias. And by bias, we are referring to not just explicit, but also implicit bias, right? I think that's also something that's important to unpack here, because explicit bias to some extent, I think, are somewhat recognized and acknowledged in the field of ADR, and in some instances have been formalized, if you will, in the ethical standards and guidelines. But it is the implicit bias, the implicit forms of biases that are a lot harder and difficult to navigate and to manage. And I think that's where there's a lot more that can be done, and that information, at a broader level is out there, but it needs to be also brought into the ADR context to help practitioners, better understand and also learn how to overcome, or at least disrupt, implicit biases that might play out. If I may just add another thought, and this relates back to the survey findings. So going back to your question, Rick, what are some ways in which our biases may show up in ADR practice? Based on the survey's findings that we have, there are a couple of observations that I could draw from the analysis, which is that number one, implicit bias is, or I should say, bias in general, it's something that practitioners, I think, generally are aware of, and they can observe, right? When bias get manifest as microaggressions, or when their clients make or exhibit certain gestures or behaviors that suggest that they may be relying on information or unfounded assumptions based on the other party's visible demographic characteristics, such as race, gender, age, or even accent and culture or cultural attributes. And then the other side of the coin, if you will, also occurs in that practitioners, themselves are also, or at least beginning to think about how their own inherent biases, particularly implicit biases that are outside of their conscious awareness, may also operate, during the ADR process, and to what extent that may influence the outcomes and the process as well.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the kind of combination of things here. So, similar to Cheryl, the example that I always bring up that would drive me nuts is if there was a mediation between a man and a woman, and the man would say something and then turn to me and say, "You're a man, you know what I'm talking about." And my immediate thought is, I have no idea what you're talking about. And, so there's that identity that we bring into the room, and the perceptions that the participants have of us. And then there's this other piece about the assumptions that we may have about the participants. And it sounds like trying to navigate and sort of parse that out can be really tricky.
It's definitely tricky doing it in the moment, as things are happening at the table and practitioners are doing their process. I find that practitioners have difficulty, unless it is so blatant that it slaps you in the face, let's say, but they have difficulty oftentimes recognizing what just happened or didn't happen with regard to a dimension of diversity where implicit bias is concerned, or difficulty picking up on what might be cues, both verbally and nonverbal cues, that something else is going on. And so I encourage practitioners always, particularly where a dimension of diversity is at least at the table, is to afterwards to do a reflection, to do a reflection of what just happened, to walk through it, to ask yourself questions that could identify whether or not it was actually an issue in the room. I've also seen and talked to practitioners that when it comes up, maybe a participant brings up an issue of race or gender, then the notion is, what do I do now? Because either it came out of left field and they weren't prepared for it. So that's the other part of the discussions that need to happen in our field is, kind of what to do when you don't know what to do. And the issue is a matter of one of the dimensions of diversity.
Great. And I love the distinction here of just, thinking about how do we prepare for what's going to happen in, our ADR practice, and then what do we do in the moment when something arises and we need to react to it. We're going to get to practical tips, hopefully, and a little bit later in the conversation. I was going to move on, but let me check. Ray, it looked like you were about to say something.
I'm good.
Okay. So on the screen, hopefully our audience can see that. We have the 5 kind of key findings, and we might jump around through these in sort of a different order. But, one of them here was that there's this tension between supporting DEI and practicing ADR, and specifically that the values of neutrality, impartiality, which are primary features of ADR, that those things conflict with promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a specific quote from the survey that I'd like to read. It states, I acknowledge that due to unconscious bias in practice, my own neutrality might not be as immutable as I hope and believe it to be. I think that raises some interesting points here. So based on the research findings and based on, each of your own experience, how does bias really affect an ADR practitioner's neutrality?
Cheryl, you want to go first?
Oh, I was going to let you go first. So I will. I think, first of all, let me just say that as we talk about, neutrality and impartiality, I think we need to go back even to our training, because at least in most trainings that I am familiar with, we don't really talk about those 2 issues as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think we need to start there. So does your own neutrality, is it not as immutable as I believe? It absolutely is not. And I think we do a disservice when we believe that our neutrality, we can walk into the room and that neutrality stays constant throughout a particular mediation or facilitation. Unless you're not human, it doesn't. It moves. It moves with what is going on in the room. And again, I don't think we talk about that enough. It's, we tell parties that we are impartial, or if we're still using that word, or we're neutral. Where the fact of the matter is, we may try to be, but it's not like a brick wall. It does move. And so again, in this area of diversity, equity, inclusion, my guess is it moves, yours moves, the parties move, everybody's moving. And so while all this motion is going on, we as practitioners, for the most part, have not been trained to identify it. And as I said earlier, we certainly don't know what to do oftentimes when it shows up. And so that whole debate about whether or not we're impartial versus neutral, for me, I'm working on the neutral part, because the impartiality is, no, I'm not. I try my best to be neutral with regard to, the issues that are being confronted in the parties, but I have to realize that that's a moving target. As things happen at the table, so does that move, which again brings the notion of reflecting, what did I do? What did I say? Why did I say it? Why did I react that way? And that's something that we don't do as much of as I think we should as practitioners. in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, so a few kind of bold claims here. One, that idea that our neutrality and impartiality are very mutable, and as you said, are moving targets. And then the other, which we'll get to maybe in a bit, is the idea that ADR training needs to better address these issues. But Ray, yeah, any response to what Cheryl's asserting here?
Sure. You might have noticed me like nodding my head in agreement. And I was also going to say that, to say that, I think for me, my perspectives certainly come more from the academic, scholarship side of things. And what I heard Cheryl say, really resonated with what actually has been put forth and discussed in the scholarship and in the research literature in relation to this issue the relationship between bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and how that relates to neutrality and impartiality, for ADR practitioners and in the ADR process. And I think this notion that, neutrality is a more dynamic, a more fluid kind of phenomenon that, really needs to kind of be, I think that is an important idea, right? That we often perhaps forget. And when we talk about neutrality, it's more from that perspective that it's fixed, that it's static. We talk about practitioners being neutral, being impartial, which accompanies the assumption that it's a static state, it's a fixed state. And I think Cheryl is right on point in terms of bringing up this idea or this observation that maybe we have to rethink about our notion and conception of neutrality. And going back to the literature, there actually has been some arguments and perspectives put forth and proposals or theories, I should say, that in a way reframes what we think about neutrality in terms of, intrinsic versus extrinsic neutrality, and also the idea of neutrality being more dynamic and fluid in nature, and that it can shift. And it's a constant, effort on the part of the practitioners to maintain, right, that state or that experience of being neutral in the moment and in the ADR process. So let me just kind of go back to the extrinsic versus intrinsic neutrality piece, because I think that also relates to this idea about conscious versus unconscious bias, or sometimes we say explicit versus implicit bias, right? So, let's start with bias first, right? So with extrinsic bias, we can think about, first of all, definition of bias, right? So bias refers to attitudes or beliefs that occur, whether in our conscious or unconscious awareness, that can affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions. And particularly in relation to, our interactions and judgments about people. So when we talk about explicit bias, these are, we think about the, visible, tangible gestures, words, behaviors that people exhibit that demonstrate their, attitude or belief about, something, right? So for example, someone who has a Confederate flag, in front of the house, or, someone who has a Black Lives Matter, poster, on their car. These signs, these symbols tell us, something about people's attitudes and people's beliefs, right, about a given issue and such. And then with implicit bias, again, the idea that it is unconscious, that it lies under the conscious knowledge of the being, and it's often associated with automatic responses as a result of long social conditioning of the images, of the messages that we get about, people of certain social groups and such. So, for example, I will use myself as an example, right? I mean, people see me as an Asian female, right? And, there have been instances where I can infer from someone's words or gestures, for example, if I'm having a conversation, interpersonal interaction with someone, just very randomly and casually at the beginning of our interaction says, oh, you speak really good English. So in the US context, I know that statement, however unintentional and conveyed with good intentions, do carry negative connotations and can be construed, negatively by the recipient, right? The Asian female in that case. So, but yet the individual who conveyed that statement, may not be aware that is the interpretation of the meaning behind that statement for me. And so, and what drives that, arguably will be some kind of implicit bias, right? About, Asians being the perpetual foreigner, in the United States. So, which again, is coupled with a long history, context and narratives that led us to, have that association, under our conscious awareness. So tying it to this idea of extrinsic versus intrinsic neutrality, right? And the idea of these different forms of neutrality could also play out in the sense that, when we talk about extrinsic neutrality, it is about the behaviors, about the gestures, the words that an ADR practitioner is trained, is aware of exhibiting before, doing, and after the ADR process, right? Say, for example, making, even eye contact, making conscious effort to make sure that the parties at the mediation table has, same amount of time, air time, to be able to voice their opinions and views and such, right? That's explicit, that is tangible, that's observable and such. And we could, think about extrinsic neutrality being manifest in those behaviors and actions. Intrinsic neutrality, I think it becomes a little trickier because that would relate to, the extent to which implicit bias may affect a practitioner's intrinsic, ability to stay neutral and to maintain that neutrality over the ADR process, right? So I think there is some value to thinking about, how we think about the idea of neutrality, and to what extent are there different forms of that to which, ADR practitioners have to think about and take steps to kind of cultivate neutrality, not just outwardly, but also inwardly.
Yeah, and Cheryl, I see you're nodding along. Any additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't think I've thought about it in the terms of there are different types of, but you're right. And what we kind of teach is that, there's one, you're impartial, you're neutral. And we don't dive into the various types of neutrality. So that's fascinating. I have to look at that some more as you were talking. I was thinking, okay, let me write that down because I'm gonna have to look into that deeper.
I'm definitely happy to share references and resources after the session, with everyone, relating to these ideas.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. And for everyone's, knowledge, we're going to get deeper into resources in just a little bit. But I noticed I was monitoring the chat and I thought this was a really interesting conversation. This comes from Annie Hilb, who said, I really prefer the term all partiality. And we talked earlier about that idea versus saying like, I am neutral, versus sort of I'm being neutral, or I have neutrality that is mutable. What are your thoughts about all partiality? I'm inferring that to mean, I guess in my kind of training, the idea of, rather than sort of taking one person's side or trying not to take a side, the idea that you're sort of taking everyone's side. I'm here to kind of advocate for all of you and, sort of help you kind of do this together. And when there's, conversations where there's debates about the truth, it's, I'm assuming that everything you say is true, even if those things are contradicting each other. So I might be interpreting all partiality differently, but I wonder if you have any immediate thoughts about it.
Well, I can certainly say something to that, Rick, as you were describing, and kind of pointing out the comment in the chat on this term, all partiality. I can actually say that this resonates. This is consistent with some ideas that have been put forth in the research and scholarship. And they call it, I think the similar term, but they call it omnipartiality, So it's suddenly the idea that, rather than take no sides, you take all sides of the parties at a table. And part of the argument that underlied that concept was consistent with this notion that, we as, ADR practitioners we are fundamentally, in our essence, human beings, right? And we come into every situation with our backgrounds, our worldviews, our histories, our experiences, and that instead of creating an, somewhat arbitrary distinction that, we don't bring ourselves, our full selves into the room as neutrals, it sort of turns their idea on the head and embrace and advocate, I suppose, for the embracing of, your full identity, in service of facilitating, the process in the room, at the same time recognizing that the other parties in the room are also going to bring their histories and backgrounds and perspectives into the fold. And even with that, when you have all that in the room, it does not necessarily have to take away the values of neutrality and impartiality, as we think about, those ideals in ADR practice.
So thank you, Rick, for defining it, because that's going to be my first. Okay, so what is it? I guess for me, as I'm sitting here, okay, so this is heresy, but let me just say it. I don't really care what you call it. What I would like for practitioners to understand is, if it's called this term or whatever, it still moves. You still have to be aware of what you brought in, what they brought in, and what is happening now, and how, as Ray said, the baggage, the background that we bring in, how it impacts what we do at the table. So if you're going to use the term, okay, so what was it? I started writing it down and then I stopped. And now okay, so what was it?
All partiality.
All partiality. Okay, that's fine. Let's use that. But let's also recognize, again, that that doesn't absolve us from being aware of the impact that our biases, because even with that, we still have them, and how it might impact the parties, the process at the table with regard to various dimensions of diversity. I don't know that we can come up with a term. Okay, so in my view, let me just put it this way. In my view, impartiality, neutrality, or the new one, okay. But again, that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility of being aware of what our biases, implicit, explicit, how they come into the room, how they impact parties, how what's going on at the table moves that all partiality, from time to time, and being aware that it just happened. Oh dear, it just moved. And now what do I do, if anything? So I guess that was my reaction. I've certainly, I've done mediations, unfortunately, where mine moved. Okay. Yeah, I'm neutral. I'm all partial. And something was said or done, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, wait a minute, hold it. Uh-oh. I might not be as neutral as I thought I was 10 seconds ago. And so now what am I going to do? And in fact, in one situation, while it's going on, I'm having a conversation about whether or not I can continue. And shortly, called for a recess, talked to my partner, got myself back together. So for me, it's less of what we call it. It is more of teaching, being aware of, reflecting continually that it changes. It is still not static, even if we're for all the parties. it still moves. And what do we do when it moves? How do we recognize it? And what do we do about it, either in the moment or, in terms of our future mediations and facilitations?
Yeah, thanks for this. This is reminding me of, what somebody once taught me about kind of catching like a bad habit. You have to, first you have to know that you do it. Then you have to know that you just did it. Then you have to know that you're doing it now, and then eventually get to the point of knowing like, oh, I'm about to do it. And that's where you intervene. And it sounds like, what's coming out of this conversation and the research is that, there's the training piece certainly is missing. So we need, more robust support to help ADR practitioners develop that awareness, but then also the tools to intervene and to do something differently once they do have that awareness. I want to push the conversation in a slightly different direction, because I want to take it a step further and see what your thoughts are here. So I'm going to read another quote from the survey. This is a bit of a longer one, so stick with me here. In most cases, the employee feels that they're not being treated fairly or appropriately by their manager. They sometimes offer long stories of really bad treatment, which is often disregarded by the agency and written off as someone just being a bad boss, or written off as statements like, well, we all have bad bosses from time to time. They treat everyone that way. So the agency representative, even if they're somewhat sympathetic to the complaint, in the end is rather dismissive, just furthering the lack of inclusiveness. What I sort of pulled from this quote is, and kind of drawing from my own experiences, is sometimes we might hear in the context of an ADR conversation, these dynamics that are happening at the organization level. So it sort of speaks to this broader pattern of exclusive, inequitable behavior and treatment. And sometimes we actually see those patterns kind of replicated at the mediation table, that's representative of something happening across the organization. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, particularly because like this research, part of what prompted it was this broader context, this broader social conversation where people are sort of waking up to, oh, I have a greater role in this change than I previously realized. So to what degree, do ADR practitioners, have a duty to try to change those broader dynamics in organizations?
So I'm thinking about the word duty. Oh boy. Say duty to a lawyer, and it's like, oh my gosh. So let me put the word aside and try to respond. I think as practitioners, we have an opportunity that for some of us, we may not ever have again, which would be great. I think because of, George Floyd, et cetera, at least is certainly what I've seen, are both people and organizations are now looking at their organizations and saying, what changes do I need to make? How can I be more inclusive? How can I create an environment that is truly belonging and connected? So I think we have a window of opportunity to help organizations. I'll talk about organizations since you were talking workplace, and that's where Vantage does a lot of their work. I think as practitioners, we have a window of opportunity to highlight and to have people look at and then try to change a culture which has not valued when a person in a marginalized group says something just happened that from my perspective is racially, culturally, gender, whatever, that we oftentimes do exactly what you said. We kind of push it aside and determine for whatever reason that it didn't happen the way the person said it happened, it's not important, oh, that's just that person. So I'm not sure that I don't know that I would use the word duty, but we certainly have an opportunity to have conversations that maybe we didn't, even this survey, you know, I don't know how many of those 43 people would have responded if what we're seeing around us was not happening. I hope they would. So I think we certainly have an opportunity to work with organizations to create environments that don't just push aside when a person says. So when a person like me, for example, and I'll just take me because I know more about me, when a Black or brown person says that it is race, it's race. It's race. Now, you know, we can talk about intersectionality and we can talk about, well, that's the way that person is, but why is that person that way? And why is that person behaving that way in the responsibility and in the role that they have in this organization? And oh, by the way, okay, so that's the way that person is. By not doing anything, are you saying that the organization condones this action? Really? That which we, okay. So yes, we have an opportunity. I don't know if that's a duty or not. I'll think about the duty word, but we certainly have an opportunity. Did that answer your question? Did I respond to your question?
Thank you so much. One of the things that's jumping out at me here in our conversation is how important our language distinctions are, and you know, just the terminology that we use. I think really changes how we frame certain things. So I appreciate that change of frame. So we'll think about it as an opportunity. But Ray, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I was also going to confer that, you know, I think that, you know, these types of scenarios should certainly be construed as opportunities, right? And I think, you know, going back to this question of what should ADR practitioners, you know, address, acknowledge, deal with these patterns of behaviors when they see it in their interaction with the clients. I think it certainly depends on the context, right? And depending on what type of ADR work is being involved. One of the things that came to my mind, it's certainly, you know, if we are talking about the practitioner who is in a role of being a dispute system designer, for instance, then I think a scenario like that would certainly be right up the alley, you know, in terms of really helping the client organization to really, you know, help them kind of, well, if they're not even in the stage of recognition, to even get to that point of recognizing that something is going on, not just at the individual, the interpersonal level, but this is really about the whole organization, right? So that's that piece of it. I do want to kind of, you know, deviate from the question a little bit because I think this ties more to the survey findings that we got, which is that one of the things that also emerged from the survey findings beyond this, beside this theme around bias, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about bias, how bias show up, and what's the relationship between bias, particularly implicit bias, unconscious bias, with, you know, practitioners' ability and you know, the effort in maintaining neutrality and impartiality. But then the other thing that really also stood out from the findings was this growing recognition that you know, issues relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, when they play out in forms of microaggressions, when it plays out in the forms of you know, encountering stereotypical remarks or gestures or behaviors or prejudiced actions, you know, towards others. This does not happen at the individual level only. It happens at the group level, it happens at the system level, it happens at structural levels, right? So some of the comments, for instance, that were expressed in the surveys spoke to, you know, the observations that some of the practitioners have made with respect to the lack of representation of neutrals of color, you know, on ADR rosters, the lack of or uneven access to opportunity to be assigned, you know, cases or to have opportunities into you know, mentoring or networks that would allow, you know, for a more level playing field, right? So these are the things that also came forth in the survey responses. Now, one other thing that I would also mention too is that the unfortunate state of affairs is that these issues have been brought up, 20 years ago in the ADR research and scholarship. One of the very first articles that has started to talk about, the role, the influence of, or the role of diversity and inclusion in the ADR context was published in the late 1990s. I mean, fast forward 20 years, we really haven't made much progress, but I think the good news is the momentum is building, and over the last 3 or 4 years, even in the research and scholarship domain, we are starting to see more interest in scholarship that really tries to look at, issues relating to DEI and what that means for ADR practice. What does that mean for, the values and the way we practitioners, right, do their work in the field. So I think that's the good news. And then as part of that is this growing recognition that, we have to go beyond just thinking about what can practitioners do themselves to interrupt bias, to get more culturally competent at the individual level. There's also the responsibility, the duty, Cheryl, to add to your ponder for thought, the obligation of ADR practitioners, depending on what roles they have, right? Are they a roster manager? Are they a program coordinator? Are they a mediator or arbitrator? To also pay attention to patterns of inequality, to inequities, patterns of uneven access to opportunities, of uneven representation across these different programs and structures and environments within which the ADR profession resides. I think that's where we need to start paying attention, paying more attention to, and to not just focus on individual efforts to improve our own capacity, in cultural competence and bias interruption, but also look beyond and looking at the systems and the structural levels.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm reflecting on one particular comment from the survey, and I don't have it in front of me, but I recall that it had specifically to do with the standards of ethics and conduct that ADR practitioners abide by, and sort of pointing out that those standards are often written with, kind of a narrow group of people. So even sort of, broadening kind of who's contributing to that conversation and who's really thinking about, how we influence mediators' behavior, that we need to widen that group. I had a question and I lost it. I know there's a couple of things coming in the chat that I'll try to jump back to, but Cheryl, any other follow-up thoughts while we're here?
Well, I'm glad to hear that at least the interest in making a more equitable field is increasing. I remember my very first ADR workshop at a conference that I attended, having come out of politics, coming over to conflict resolution, and it was a panel talking about the lack of diversity, within the field. And okay, so I'm about to date myself, but oh wow, that was 2005, and we are still having you could almost take a recording of that workshop and play it today, and people would think that it just happened. So as someone said in the chat, it's difficult, probably impossible, to really talk about equality when you look at the lack of equity in practitioners, in programs, and the same questions are being asked, or where can I find practitioners, diverse practitioners who are skilled. I was like, okay, so we still have that problem? It's kind of how I think about it, but I'm glad that, interest, and I think, again, that's the window of opportunity that I'm talking about. The interest is there, It's kind of like the chicken or the egg. You got to do both at the same time, because talking about equity and inclusion without having equity and inclusion, doesn't really work.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really interesting here is I'm looking at the results of the poll survey that we launched earlier. I'm going to share these results so others can see them. But primarily everybody here is an ADR practitioner and or an ADR program manager, and no one identified as a DEI practitioner. And I find that striking for a couple of reasons. So one is, as I engage with a lot of people who do identify as DEI practitioners, one of the things that they sort of lament about is the fact that they keep showing up to these sort of conversations with other DEI practitioners, and they want sort of a broader array of people to be coming to these conversations. So I do appreciate that the folks here are kind of ADR practitioners foremost, and are jumping into the conversation, really looking for that knowledge and that information. And I want to kind of move. I want to do this. So I love to do a little bit of a breakout exercise, because we're starting to move that conversation forward, thinking about how do we retrain ADR practitioners? How do we restructure ADR programs and those kind of support the infrastructure around ADR. I'd love to put people in small breakouts and also kind of think about resources, and particularly ADR resources. What are things that have worked for you? What are things you've read? What are things you've tried? What are, whatever it might be. I want to let folks self-define that. And then we'll kind of solicit, we'll come back from a breakout and kind of solicit what folks talked about, but really thinking about, at this intersection of ADR and DEI, what are resources that you're looking for, that you've found? Great. Yep. Welcome back, folks. I see our breakout rooms are closing down. We'll give it just a few more seconds for everyone to get back on. I know we had a couple of folks who had to jump off as well.
But I see lots of faces. Rick, look at all these lovely faces.
Oh, see, you're seeing something that I don't have. Okay, I see Cheryl and I see Ray.
I'm seeing faces.
Good. I want to give a chance for folks to jump in, so you can kind of give answers in the chat if there's resources that you'd like to share with everyone. And I'm going to give Cheryl and Ray a chance to maybe share some resources as well. One that I want to point out, which I thought was interesting, Mark Sachs indicated the ladder of inference. I forget where in the conversation he dropped that, but he said, this reminds me of the ladder of inference, which is sort of a theory that describes how we move from kind of experiencing and observing the world around us to, adding meaning to what we observe, forming assumptions and conclusions, and eventually leading to more concrete beliefs, which then inform our actions. And it's just a really simplistic model, but it's one that I use quite a lot to help describe that purpose. And so I think that's worth kind of looking into. But yeah, Cheryl, Ray, any resources that you'd really like to share with folks who are in the audience today?
So I'm putting one in the chat, and unfortunately I don't have the website, but if you Google racial equity tools, it is a website that has all kinds of, and it's general information. It's not necessarily geared to ADR practitioners, but if you're looking for, I'll call it general information, although some of it is very specific. They have books, they have articles, they have podcasts, websites, a whole array of resources. And if, I hate to add to anybody's inbox, but if you sign up, they will periodically send you an email indicating that there's new items on their website. So that is something that I use from time to time and have recommended to people.
Fantastic, thanks. And I see Tara's dropping some of those things into the chat for us. Ray, any thoughts here?
Sure. So for me, I did zoom in on just in part because, again, given the significant interest that folks have indicated on the survey around trying to really, enhance their awareness and knowledge around, the issue of bias, and particularly around implicit bias. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of books that will really get at, not just the scientific evidence and the research findings, but also really help folks better understand the different types of, unconscious and implicit bias that can play out in everyday situations. So if you haven't heard of those, here they are. This is a book called Blind Spot, and I can send out the info with the ADR team after ADR Vantage team after this session as well. So this is this is considered the authoritative text by Banerjee and Greenwald, who were the founders of the implicit association test, which is says your automatic associations, about different kind of categories of stuff. So this was published in 2013, one of the first, popular texts that really unpacks and translates, scientific evidence around implicit biases to the popular audience. And then a more current one is called Biased. This is by I think a Stanford psychologist, Jennifer Eberhardt, which is a more up-to-date, I think, popular review of, cognitive distortions, biases, and prejudices that can occur in everyday life. And then the third one is by an NYU psychologist, The Person You Mean to Be, Dolly Chuck. And she provides this very accessible, text, also kind of unpacking bias and in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, areas as well.
Awesome.
Can I just ask a logistical question? So it's great that we're putting this all in the chat. Are we going to get this list? Like the people who are on the call or register, are we going to get this list? Or do I need to start writing?
I think that's such a good question. And it looks like we've got some really good resources there, and we'll find a way to get those to everyone after today's session. So thanks. I want to encourage folks to keep submitting those. If you've got more, you can drop them into the chat. But now with the time we have left, I do want to open up the floor and just see, what questions you all have for us and for each other.